Chapter 5 discusses the Revolutionary War, the conflict between the British and their former North American colonies, the people that will soon become known as Americans from the United States of America. Let's begin by talking about the task that George Washington had. George Washington was chosen as Commander-in-Chief, or as he would ask his subordinates to call him, His Excellency George Washington, as a show of not confidence or arrogance, but as a show of respect. He understood that chain of command and that understanding that you don't question the leadership in the military was important, and that's why he required that title. He had quite a task. He was going up against the greatest army in the world, quite simply put. Also, the greatest navy, and the Americans had no army and no navy. The British had unending resources. The Americans had very few. They had a trained, disciplined, well-funded, well-supplied army that knew how to fight and knew how to win wars. And George Washington knew that from having fought with them in the 7 Years' War. And he took an army of what his British counterparts would call rabble. They're just trash. And they weren't trash, but that was a British opinion of the American army, the Continental Army. But George Washington understood that he had undisciplined, unsupplied, untrained men who didn't have any unity to speak of, who didn't have necessarily a sense of what necessarily the cause was, but they needed to listen to Washington. They needed to listen to their generals, their superiors, and to stick to the strategy, which was seen very early on in the way that Washington kept his army together in the later months of 1776. By the end of 1776, the original volunteers, the original patriots who made up the Continental Army, their one-year volunteer contracts for fighting was coming to an end. They were about to expire, and there were no victories to speak of. And people were beginning to lose faith in the cause and also beginning to lose faith in George Washington's leadership. There were multiple assassination plots that were foiled before they could be carried out. Thomas Hickey being the architect of one of them that Washington had executed. And Washington understood when 1777 comes around, I might not have an army left because they're going to leave. They have no confidence in me. They have no confidence that this can be done. They're up against it. The way I always describe it is in sports terms, being a sports guy, the Continental Army was kind of like a high school football team taking on the New England Patriots of Tom Brady's era. Good luck, because you're going to need it, because you really have no shot. Washington understood that. And at the end of 1776, not only to keep his army together, but also to potentially, quote unquote, win the war and gain independence by defeating the British Army, he began to develop a strategy that today we would call guerrilla warfare. And this was hit and run, sneak attacks, avoidance of the enemy the way that they wanted to be fought in traditional open field battle. And the strategy became prolong the war. Turn this war into another money pit where taxes go up on British citizens over in London. And the British government says, we give up because it's really financially not worth it to continue fighting to keep these 13 colonies. And that's the strategy that will win American independence. Had the British wanted to win this thing no matter what, at whatever cost, however long it took, they could have. It's simple. But Washington's strategy to prolong a war that he felt that the British would not support indefinitely was the correct strategy. The battles of Trenton and Princeton in late 76, early 77 are great examples of this guerrilla warfare sneak attack that was able to boost morale with his men and keep the army together so that those contracts expired and the men stuck around. They began to gain confidence in not only Washington's leadership, but also in their ability to maybe win this thing. But again, it doesn't go without complications. The Americans get their one really great massive military victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 77, which is proof enough to the French, the great rival of the British, that we could win this thing if they helped us. And the French become our ally because of the victory at Saratoga. But as the French are preparing to bring their army over and begin supplying us, The army almost falls apart in the winter of 77-78 through that brutally cold winter at Valley Forge. And George Washington, again, shows his great leadership um, in being able to keep that army together through training and drilling them and foraging for food and scavenging for food and leading by example and keeping the army together through that winter. And just another great testament to his leadership by keeping that army together through the winter at Valley Forge. Ultimately, what won the American Revolution and what won independence? Well, there's a variety of ways that you could argue that, and historians have for years. Washington's leadership was critical. His strategy was critical. The French alliance was critical. The British impatience with the war on the heels of the 7 Years' War was critical. The belief in the British that government of the people, by the people, for the people would fail, and that they'd be able to scoop the colonies right back up. I mean, that's a part of it. But ultimately, it was the United States working together, the Americans working together, whether it be the women at home supporting the men in the field. It was a combination of factors that resulted in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, with the British acknowledging, although they didn't think it would last, the existence of an independent nation known as the United States of America. Probably the great last example of Washington's leadership that often gets forgotten in history was an event known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. Near the end of the war, a lot of these soldiers had not been paid. They had been promised they'd be paid in these Continental bonds. The government never paid them. They were becoming impatient, and nearing the end of the fighting, after Yorktown, a lot of these guys said, "We're fed up with this. The government's not paying us. They're not following through with their end of the bargain." This is long before the Constitution is written, where the government even has a way to finance these Continental bonds. But they meet together in Western Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania, and a lot of these guys say, "You know what? Done. We traded a tyrant across the ocean for a tyrant right here. We traded a government that wouldn't take care of us across the ocean for a government that still won't take care of us here. Why don't we abandon the coast, head inland, and leave the coast available for British reconquest or French conquest or German conquest? That'll show the government." And Washington gets wind of this. And as a lot of these conspirators are planning to meet to discuss actually carrying out this Newburgh Conspiracy, Washington finds out when and where they're going to meet, and he surprises them in this meeting. He walks into this tent. I mean, you probably could have heard a pin drop at that moment in history. And Washington walks in, and he unfurls the speech that he had written from his coat pocket, and he pulls out a pair of glasses and puts them on. And before he begins to speak this prepared speech that he had given to these conspirators who were about to commit treason against their country, he says, "Gentlemen, forgive me. I've grown old and blind in service to you, in service to this country." Who had given more? Who had sacrificed more than George Washington, who had been there since 75? Through Valley Forge, through these defeats, Long Island, and defending West Point, and the attempt to assassinate him by Hickey, and the attempt to have him given over to the British by Benedict Arnold, the first traitor in American history. Who had gone through more? Who had sacrificed more? He's grown old and blind. And then he gives this great speech in which he tells these men, he goes, "You're losing sight of what you did. It's bigger than you. It's for the unborn millions, the people that will inherit a nation where they have freedom and consent of the governed. And you guys are losing sight of this. Your momentary needs are outweighing the long-term goals of the unborn millions." And by the time he leaves that tent after giving that speech, the conspiracy is done. It's dissolved. And these men have been reinvigorated to go, "Yeah, it's not about me and my suffering right now. It's about the future." And it's over. It's one of the great examples of Washington's leadership there at the end of the war. But tragically, as the United States gains official recognition from the British, this doesn't change anything for African Americans, for Native Americans, or for women. Women demand rights in this new country. The famous correspondence between Abigail Adams and her husband, John, in which John sort of laughs at her and says, and when she says, "Remember the ladies," and he kind of goes, "Where does that end?" Next thing you know, we're going to have people of color wanting rights and things like that. And so, really, sort of the tragedy of the American Revolution is that it doesn't live up to that all men are created equal. Really, nothing changes for any of those groups of people. Sure, a couple of northern colonies that will become the northern United States will abolish slavery, a lot of it gradually, a lot of it compensated so that owners get money for emancipating their enslaved people. But I think the issue here is this, is that the hypocrisy was not lost on everyone. Okay. The fact that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were hunting down runaway enslaved people who chose to self-emancipate during this conflict is not lost on everyone. It's not lost on them. Nevertheless, they're engaging in this heinous activity of recovering people who are self-emancipating or demanding liberty. One of the most famous comments was from a loyalist, someone who supported the British during the war. This guy Samuel Johnson, who commented pretty profoundly to end this chapter summary for you, that it seemed like during the Revolution, the loudest yelps for liberty came from the drivers of the enslaved. These guys are crying for liberty, and they're owning people and denying them freedom. What hypocrites that they're going to found this country on the demand for liberty and then deny it to people because they have a different skin color than them. So to us today, it's obvious the hypocrisy of the revolution, to declare all men equal and then deny it to basically everyone, other than a very small group of people who were leading the nation. But it was not lost on some of their contemporaries, like Samuel Johnson.